Now, Libya's eastern government has told journalists to leave the flood-devastated city of Derna. A minister said journalists were impeding the work of rescue teams. Critics say the authorities are trying to avoid international security. On Monday, there were protests in Derna demanding accountability for authorities' failure to maintain two dams which collapsed during storms last week. Thousands of residents were killed, and the catastrophe has also left tens of thousands homeless and in need of clean water and basic supplies. I'd like to welcome Aya Burweiler. She's a widely published security expert and commentator with a special focus on Libya. Thanks for joining us, Aya. Is there a risk that these protests in Derna could grow and worsen the current crisis there?
Absolutely. The entire country is extremely shocked with the turn of events. This is not something that Libya was prepared for, and it was certainly not something Libyans expected. And the death toll is so high, so incredibly high, over 3,000 people and counting. And this is not the final numbers. So these protests will grow, and I think it'll grow all over the country. This is not the first time the country has seen protests, not just for the floods, but for the standard of living that Libyans have to suffer through. Despite being an oil-rich nation, despite getting rid of a long-time dictatorship in 2011, Libyans have not seen the development that they deserve. And unfortunately, whether these protests that have taken place in Tripoli over the postponement of elections, they've been faced with repression from the governments in Tripoli and so forth. So any attempt really for Libyans to protest in the West to remove their governments have been faced with hostility. This has shaken the nation, and this could be a turning point.
I mean, of course, thousands have died in these floods. And then, of course, there are the thousands who have survived and who are now desperate for the basics. The UN is warning of a humanitarian crisis in Libya. What do our authorities need to do, and what, in fact, can they do to address this, to address these needs?
They're scrambling. All the authorities are scrambling in the East. This is not something we are prepared for, certainly. And the nature of the flood, the lack of accessibility to Derna by roads has made the situation even worse. So crisis preparedness is a huge factor, but also now there's an added crisis of dead bodies and how to bury them to avoid disease. So there is coordination with governments. The French government has opened a field hospital. But it is also dangerous to access Derna. I would like to say that this tragedy is international. Recently, Greece right now is in the morning because a member of the rescue mission have died en route to Derna because of a collision. Two young people died. Actually, one of my colleagues and friend, Vandalios. This has shaken the city as well.
Okay. If we could just move on to the next question, because we do have a limit on the time. Yes. I wanted to ask you about Khalifa Haftar, the leader of the Libyan National Army who controls the region. He's being accused of using the disaster to enrich himself rather than helping civilians. Is there any way for international organisations to ensure aid gets to those who need it? And is there any way to get things done without corruption being involved?
I think there has been accusations flying and rumours fly around in Libya all the time. And I think it's really, really important to recognise that Libya is a country at war with two sides. I think it's important to investigate. I know for a fact that the army had warned civilians to evacuate the region and to be removed. Unfortunately, there is no crisis mentality. A lot of people didn't take these warnings seriously as well, but also the telecommunications. This kind of disaster requires immediate mobile notifications. Having said that, corruption is a huge problem in the country. Libya is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And as I say always, corruption is a human security threat and must be addressed immediately.
Aya Burweiler, security expert and Libya specialist. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Anas El-Ghamati, a Libyan political analyst. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on with these protesters, what they're demanding for.
Well, the protesters have been demanding since last night the end of the rule of Libya's parliament that blocked elections for the last decade, that blocked the local elections that would have seen them being able to elect a reliable and responsive and known local council, not the nephew of the chief of parliament, Ageda Salah. So there has been a number of demands that are now also spreading across the country, because these protests are like the pulse of the nation. And when that pulse quickens, you can feel that rhythm moving across the country into Benghazi, in the east of the country, into Tripoli, the capital, where there were also protests yesterday. And so there is a movement that is beginning to emerge, and it's obviously galvanizing the way in which this disaster galvanized so many volunteers to come. It's now galvanizing an anger and a demand for justice for the very authorities, including the Libyan National Army that the House of Representatives, the Parliament in the East, appointed in 2014 and 15. This is now beginning to kind of galvanize the opinion that the authorities themselves need to be held to account. They're asking for an international investigation, and they're asking for a better response.
But do you think they'll get anywhere? Do you think this movement won't just fizzle out or be extinguished by government authorities?
I think you're right to point out that it could be extinguished. And I think the real danger right now is that we're hearing that journalists yesterday were pulled away from the demonstrations. And you have to ask yourself, why? What are the security services worried about listening or being heard from the demonstrations? And now they're being told that they have 48 hours to evacuate the city. So there's a real danger now that the protesters themselves will not be heard, and that if the international community goes dark on there, because when we lose our journalists, we lose our eyes and ears on the ground. We lose our ability to have a reliable watchdog, an independent watchdog at that. And the journalism that has taken place over the last several days it's never happened before in Derna. I mean, this has been the major issue that is facing their citizens. They can't have a conversation with their governor, so they have to speak to the world's news agencies. There's a danger that if that happens, then the international community will just abandon Derna. They'll move on to the next crisis. And then the perpetrators of this disaster will get away with it.
In the meantime, the UN is warning of a humanitarian crisis in Libya. What needs to be done now by the government to address this issue?
Well, I genuinely think that they need to step aside. I mean, the rival authorities in the east of the country, those that are in the west that have no access, but really the Libyan National Army, they have to step aside. They have choked and blockaded things from moving in. They have militarized a humanitarian intervention that needed a swift and agile response and better coordination on the ground. They should really just
step aside in the middle of a crisis?
Yes, I mean, they're literally hampering it. Step aside and allow the international community that have experts in this, let them lead the rest of this campaign. They were not reliable guardians of that city in the aftermath of what has just happened. They've been choking the response. And we saw yesterday, or the day before rather, we saw an aid agency moving from an international rescue efforts from the Greeks. A bus collided with another civilian car. 5 people were killed, 7 were injured. This is the problem with a lack of coordination, a lack of being able to orchestrate something like this. Because, let's be frank, it's like giving a butcher, it's like giving an agency like this a butcher's knife when they need a scalpel. They need to be small incisions. They have to be very careful about the way in which they organize this. And they're hampering those efforts. They're blocking journalists from doing their job. They haven't even sent translators in because they're worried about the kind of conversations those people might end up translating, not just between the international search and rescue teams, but with citizens of Derna themselves. This is a very, very difficult and brutal police state to operate in, and it's making the aid efforts even harder to sustain. So I think, yes, quite frankly, they should step aside and allow the international community to do their work unhampered and unhindered.
Those insights from Anas El-Ghamati, a Libyan political analyst. Thank you very much for being on DW.
Thank you.